It was the spring of 1883 in Willow Creek, Montana territory. The air smelled like wet earth and the promise of things growing, grass just starting to green, trees trying to remember how to bloom. The wind hadn't yet turned warm, but it carried the softness of change. That day, the Great Northern Railway let off a breath of steam and slowed to a squeal on the worn track. Folks stepped down in boots and bonnets, but one woman stepped down different. Eliza May Wilson. She wore a pale blue coat, her hat pinned tight, and clutched a white box wrapped in ivory ribbon atop a modest carpet bag. The box wasn't just wrapping. It held a wedding dress she'd sewn herself by lantern light and threadbare hope. She was 32, not young, not old, not someone you'd look twice at, unless you knew what sorrow looked like when it stood still. She'd made her living stitching clothes for townsfolk back east. Modest dresses with careful hems and strong thread. She stepped off that train like she'd stepped into a dream. Only, it wasn't the dream she'd been expecting. She looked around the platform, eyes searching for a man named Thomas Hall, the one who'd written her a year of sweet letters and promises, painted prettier than prairie sunrises. But no one waited for her. Then came the boy from the telegraph office, running dusty-legged and breathless, holding out a folded slip. She opened it. Her hands, work-worn but careful, trembled. "Eliza, I'm sorry. I thought I could, but I can't. Please don't look for me. Thomas." She didn't cry, just stared at the words like they might spell something else if she read them again. She held on to that box tighter and walked through town slow, past folks she didn't know, and buildings with paint chipping in layers. The chapel sat at the far edge, whitewashed and expectant. She sat down on its stone steps. The box rested beside her like a relic. People passed. Some looked away, some looked too long, but she just watched the wind pick at the edges of her skirt. And that's where Frank Davis found her. He wasn't the type to get involved. Not anymore. Since his wife passed, he kept his world small. Just him, his 5-year-old boy, and the work of keeping the roof from sagging. That evening he was heading back from the smithy with Jacob, the boy jabbering about nails and frogs, when he saw her. Jacob tugged his sleeve. "Daddy," he asked, "why's that lady sitting with a box like that?" Frank looked, and there she was, a woman holding heartbreak so still it looked like grace. He walked over slow, voice gentle. "Ma'am, you all right?" She looked up, her eyes like blue glass, still and full of things unsaid. "I'm fine," she said, but it sounded like a story she didn't believe herself, just waiting on someone. Jacob, curious as always, leaned forward. "Is it a cake?" he asked, pointing to the box. She gave him the softest smile. "No, sweetheart, it's a dress." "Yours?" She nodded. "You getting married?" Her lips parted but no words came, just a small shake of the head. Frank studied her. Something about the way she sat, like she'd forgotten how to hope, but hadn't quite stopped. He said, "We live just a ridge over. Ain't much, but there's a warm stove and some leftover stew if you'd care to rest." She didn't answer right away, just looked at the church, at the sky, then at the man and his son. And finally she whispered, "All right." So he lifted the box, lighter than he expected, and helped her onto the wagon seat beside Jacob. Then he took the reins, and the three of them rode off into the cool breath of spring dusk. Not toward a wedding, but maybe toward something better. Frank Davis's ranch sat just beyond the town line, tucked beneath a pair of cottonwood trees that hadn't bloomed yet, their branches still remembering winter. The path there was lined with mud-soft ruts from wagon wheels and the last of the spring thaw. As they pulled up, Eliza looked around like she wasn't sure if she was dreaming or trespassing. The house was plain, wood faded, porch a little crooked, but it stood like it had weathered more than storms, and stayed. She stepped onto the porch cautious, like she didn't want to leave footprints. The lantern by the door flickered when the wind touched it. Frank pushed open the door and said, "Ain't much, but it's home." And he said it not like an apology, but a quiet promise. Inside smelled of sawdust, cinnamon, and work. There were tools stacked near the hearth, half-carved birdhouses on the table, and a worn Bible laid open on the mantel. She stood in the middle of it, uncertain. Frank set her box down near the coat hook and gestured to the sitting room. "Sit if you like. I'll warm supper." Eliza lowered herself to the edge of a cushioned bench near the hearth, like it might vanish. She still held her bonnet in one hand, unsure if she was meant to stay long enough to set it down. Jacob had already dropped to the floor, fumbling with his bootlaces. "You don't have to," she said softly, but he grinned, proud. "I'm good at it. Ma taught me." That word, Ma, hung in the air like a church bell, echoed, even after it passed. Frank didn't flinch, just lit the fire under the pot, and stirred. He said once, when someone asked, that his wife had been the strongest person he'd ever known. Her name was Anna, and she'd liked violets and chicken pie, and read psalms every Sunday even when the pain got bad. She passed bringing their second child into the world. The baby didn't make it neither. He didn't talk about her much, but he lived like he hadn't forgotten a single thing. "Cornbread all right?" he asked over his shoulder. Eliza nodded. "Yes, thank you." The three of them ate at the table. No formality, no fuss. Jacob filled the silence with stories about a goose at school that chased the teacher. Eliza listened, like the sound of his voice could mend broken things. Frank passed her the bread without asking, topped her water when it ran low, and never, not once, did he ask what had happened at the chapel. That kind of silence was rare. After dinner, Jacob's eyes drooped. Eliza, on instinct, reached for him. "Would you mind?" she asked. Frank looked at her, then nodded slow. His room was small, with a wall once painted soft blue, now faded like morning sky. Stars cut from tin dotted the ceiling. Eliza laid him down gentle and tucked the quilt around his shoulders. As she turned, his voice caught her. "You'll be here tomorrow, right?" She paused. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know." Later, Frank handed her a folded blanket and pointed to the cushioned bench by the hearth. "You're safe here," he said. "No one's asking for anything." She took the quilt, settled onto the bench, and watched the fire throw slow shapes on the wall. She had woken up that morning a bride, and now she was a guest in a stranger's home. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. That night, she didn't cry. Not yet. But she didn't need to either. Sometimes, just not having to explain is its own kind of mercy. Spring gave way to early summer, slow, like a shy guest lingering on a porch. The frost was gone for good, and the mornings carried birdsong and the sharp smell of damp pine. Each day, Eliza rose with the sun, made breakfast for the three of them, and afterward sat for a spell on the porch swing, shawl across her shoulders, coffee in hand. Frank never said much, just handed her the cup with a quiet nod, then went about his work. Sometimes their fingers brushed, neither pulled away. She began spending more time in the backyard, where an old garden bed lay dry and forgotten. No one asked her to fix it, but she did. Started by pulling weeds in silence, letting the soil work through her hands, like it might scrub sorrow from her bones. She found an old pamphlet tucked on a shelf, Miss Tansey's Guide to Practical Kitchen Gardens. Its cover worn, pages loose, corners smudged by someone who'd once had similar hope. By the time the chamomiles bloomed down by the fence line, Eliza was planting bitter roots in neat, curved rows. Tomatoes, carrots, and radishes joined the bed, nourishment growing beside beauty. Not for show, for steadiness. Frank came out one morning and watched her kneeling in the dirt, hair tied back, sweat kissing her temples. "You don't have to do all that," he said, leaning against the post. "I know," she replied, not looking up. "That's why it helps." She taught Jacob the names of the plants. He liked saying lupines the best, like it was a magic spell. One afternoon he held up a crumpled piece of felt with 2 strings tied to it. "I made this pouch for your dress box so it don't feel lonely." She took it like it was spun from gold. "You have the kindest heart," she told him. Frank watched from the porch, quiet and still. Later that week, Eliza hung laundry on the line. A breeze caught the dress she wore. Simple cotton with a new hem. She'd sewn herself. She moved easier now, like she'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. Cora Cooper dropped by that same day, hands full of pickled eggs and opinions. Cora, Frank's longtime neighbor, was the kind who brought both pies and strong warnings. "You're settling in too well," she said, arching a brow. "You best be careful. Small towns don't let people change without asking permission." Eliza gave a small laugh, but Cora didn't. "Some folks have noticed you staying here," she added low. "Frank's kind, but not everyone understands what kindness looks like. They might start thinking things." Eliza's face faltered. "I reckon I'll mind my own," she said after a beat. "Folks can talk. I ain't hurting no one." "I know you're not," Cora said, "but you need to be ready. If he comes back." Eliza looked up. "Who?" "You know who." The word stayed with her, long after Cora left. That night, she sat with her sketchbook open, drawing quiet. She wasn't sketching bridal gowns anymore. She drew women with wide hips and colliosed hands, girls with laughter lines and shoes meant for walking, dresses with sleeves you could roll up, pockets deep enough to carry dreams. She was designing for the life she was living, not the one she was promised. And as the sun slid behind the trees, gold dripping through the kitchen window, Eliza May Wilson realized she wasn't waiting anymore. She was growing. The early summer evenings in Willow Creek held a softness that didn't need explaining. Crickets tuned up at dusk, and the smell of grass baked under sun lingered on the wind. That Saturday, the sun was still high when Cora came barreling through the front door without so much as a knock, arms full of pickled beets and a loaf of bread. "You've been avoiding me," she said, unloading the goods onto the table like a woman laying claim to territory. "I've been gardening," Eliza replied, brushing her hands on her apron. Cora looked her over. "You're glowing," she said, like someone who stopped holding her breath. Frank stepped into the doorway, arms crossed, watching the two women fall into a rhythm only history could explain. Later, with Jacob outside chasing butterflies, Cora leaned in across the table. "Are you two just making biscuits and sharing chores, or is this a courting?" Eliza flushed, but her voice stayed steady. "It's gentle," she said, "and I need gentle right now." Cora's face softened. "Then you're in the right place." That evening, the fire pit out back crackled soft. Frank, Eliza and Jacob sat in a lazy triangle, passing a plate of honey biscuits between them. Firelight kissed their faces, and the stars above blinked like they were listening in. Jacob told a story about a turtle that ran away from home to start a bakery. Eliza laughed. Her laugh was freer now, like a brook unclogged. When Jacob finally dozed on the quilt, Eliza looked at Frank across the fire. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What was she like?" "Anna?" Frank was quiet for a while, staring into the flame. "She was brave," he said finally. "Didn't talk much, but when she did, you listened. She loved her garden, and she'd make up hymns when she thought I wasn't listening. Called me stubborn, said I smelled like cedar and trouble." He smiled to himself. "Not sad, just remembering. She fought hard, right up till the end. Once, when she was joking about old age, she told me if I ever put her in a pine box she'd come back and haunt the whole house. So, I used maple, just in case." Eliza chuckled, then covered her mouth. Frank looked over. "She'd have liked you." Eliza blinked. "You say that like it's something sure." He nodded. "It is." They sat in silence again, but this one felt full, not empty. Just before heading inside, Jacob stirred and asked sleepily, "Is Miss Eliza gonna stay forever?" Eliza looked at Frank. He didn't answer, didn't need to. Later that night, Eliza stood out on the porch, shawl wrapped around her, watching the fire die down. A gentle breeze caught the hem of her dress, and from the garden, the flowers whispered, like a promise, not yet spoken. She placed a hand to her chest and whispered, "Still here," and in that whisper she wasn't talking to the wind anymore. She was talking to herself. By midsummer the days grew longer, the garden fuller, and Eliza May Wilson, lighter. Not in weight, but in burden. The house was quieter that Wednesday afternoon. Jacob was at a neighbor's for a birthday picnic. Frank was out back, sawing a new rail for the corral. Eliza stood in the sitting room, alone, flowers still on her forearms from the pie she'd half prepared and forgotten mid-roll. Her eyes settled on the box. It hadn't moved in weeks, not since the spring gave way to summer, and life had started, stretching out its arms. Still white, still tied with ribbon, still holding a piece of a woman she no longer was. She stepped toward it like approaching an old hurt. Her fingers, now stronger from garden work and baking, untied the ribbon slow, like it deserved respect. The lid came off with a soft pull. Inside, the dress lay untouched, ivory silk still smooth, lace sleeves folded like wings at rest. No yellowing, no dust, just waiting. She lifted it out, pressed it to her chest. Then she did what she hadn't done since the day she arrived. She put it on. The bodice clung to her ribs. The skirt swept down in a quiet hush. But when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a bride. She saw someone wearing a memory that no longer fit. The dress was beautiful. The stitches were true. But it wasn't hers anymore. She stepped out of it, folded it over the back of the cushioned bench. Then she moved to her sewing table, where her sketchbook sat open to a drawing she'd made weeks back, a dress with freedom in its lines and pockets deep enough for hope. She gathered scissors, needle, thread and breath. With a steady hand, she cut the bodice from the skirt, trimmed the neckline into a soft V, removed the tight sleeves and stitched on new ones from linen she'd dyed in chamomile. She added a sash, wide, sturdy, forgiving, made from leftover lace. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She worked like she was mending more than cloth. She worked like this was a letter to herself. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtain, dancing across the floor, in patterns like petals. The needle moved in and out, like a hymn she hadn't sung in years. When she finished, she stood back and looked. The dress didn't shimmer. It didn't shine. But it breathed. She slipped it on again. It draped, not clung. It wrapped her, not caged her. Then she reached into her sewing basket and pulled out the felt pouch Jacob had made. She smiled and whispered, "Some things are worth keeping close." With tiny invisible stitches, she sewed it into the inside hem, right where her hand could brush it every time she walked. Then she stepped out onto the porch, just as the sun slipped low, skies streaked in orange and lavender. Frank looked up from the railing and froze mid-saw. She stood there, barefoot, hair loose, wrapped in the dress she'd remade like a second skin. "It's the same dress," she said. Frank nodded slow, eyeing the changed sleeves and gathered sash. "It's different." "It is," she said, "because I am." And in the hush that followed, they didn't need any more words. The past don't send warning. It rides in on a dust trail or drops like a stone in quiet water. That day, summer had settled thick over Willow Creek. The air was syrupy sweet with clover, and the bees moved slow and full between the blooms. Eliza had just taken her pie from the oven, steam rising like a prayer, and was setting it to cool when the knock came. Not a soft knock, not a familiar rhythm, a knock that knew it didn't belong. She wiped her hands on her apron, peeked toward Jacob busy drawing at the table, and opened the door. There he stood. Thomas Hall. She recognized him from the old photograph he'd once sent, though his shoulders looked stiffer now, and his smile was gone. Polished boots, perfectly combed hair, and a look like the world had never asked him to earn a single thing. He held his hat in both hands now, like he knew he should have come different. "Eliza May Wilson?" he said. She didn't speak, just watched him still as a windless wheat field. "I heard you were still in town," he said, glancing over her shoulder at the cozy little kitchen, at the swing on the tree, at the boots by the door. "I wanted to explain," he started. "I wasn't ready back then. I didn't know how to say it. I panicked. I know I hurt you." She crossed her arms. Not defensive, just anchored. "I made a mistake," he added, "and I guess I hoped maybe we could start over." Eliza tilted her head. "You came back because you regret what you lost," she said. "But you never even knew what you had." His eyes darted, looking for some old version of her to cling to. But she wasn't that woman anymore. I needed someone who saw me, she said. All of me. Not someone who wanted me small and safe. Inside, Jacob laughed at something in his book. Out back, Frank's voice carried faint through the open window. Eliza stepped out and gently pulled the door behind her, just enough to make the point. I'm not the one who needs closure, she told him. He looked down at the porch boards, nodded once. Take care, Eliza. I am, she said. I truly am. And she watched him remount and turn down the road, the dust behind him clearer than the path ahead. She didn't cry. She didn't burn anything dramatic. She just turned, stepped back into her home, and pressed her hand to the inside of her dress, where the felt pouch Jacob made rested against her side. The same dress she'd remade that day, softened now by wear, but still hers. That soft, stitched pouch told her what Thomas never could. You are seen. You are chosen. You are loved. The heat of high summer softened as September crept in. Cooler nights, crickets playing louder, and the first hints of golden leaves rustling in the cottonwoods. Life on the Davis ranch moved quiet, but full. Eliza had opened her little seamstress room above the general store. Folks came from as far as Sweetwater to have their dresses let out, sleeves made longer, or hems stitched strong. Not for vanity, for dignity. Real women, she told Cora one day, deserve real dresses. She still made dinner most nights, still walked the rows of chamomiles and bitter roots in the morning. And each evening, Frank would hand her a coffee mug and sit beside her in that porch swing, letting the day ease off their shoulders. Then, one sunset, Frank stepped into the kitchen with dust on his boots and something wrapped in burlap in his hand. He didn't kneel, didn't stammer, just stood there, shifting slightly in the light from the stove, holding the bundle like it might shift the course of a river. He cleared his throat, rubbed the back of his neck, and looked her square in the eye. I'd be honored to walk this life with you, side by side, he said, voice steady, but low. Eliza didn't smile. Not yet. She looked at him, really looked, at the man who'd built things without fuss, who'd offered her quiet instead of pressure, who'd given a boy a roof and a woman a reason. He gently unwrapped the burlap. Inside was a small wooden box, rough but beautifully carved, the lid inlaid with a single tin star, cut from the same scraps he'd used for Jacob's ceiling. Inside sat a ring. Not flashy, not store-bought, just a smooth silver band, the inside edge etched with her initials beside his. Eliza looked from the ring to the man, and then she smiled, slow and full. Yes, she said, plain and proud, yes. And for the first time in years, she felt no tremble beneath her words. A week later, under the old cottonwood tree, where the swing still swayed in the breeze, they were married. Cora made a cake from scratch. Jacob wore a button-up shirt, 2 sizes too big, and carried the rings with all the seriousness of a judge. The preacher was local, the vows were simple, and the guest list was whoever loved them enough to show up with a smile. Eliza wore a new dress she'd sewn for the day, soft ivory linen with chamomile-dyed sleeves, stitched from scraps of old hope and new grace. She didn't need satin or lace, just something honest, breathable, and beautiful in its becoming. Frank wore his best shirt, pressed twice himself, and boots he'd cleaned so well, they almost shined. When the preacher asked if they'd take each other, Eliza looked into Frank's eyes and said, with all I am, not because I was broken, but because I was found. And Frank, steady as the ridge, replied, with all I have, not to save you, but to walk beside you. Then, with Jacob standing between them like the bond they never asked for, but were given anyway, Frank leaned in and kissed her, soft, certain, no rush, no doubt, just a kiss that said, I choose you, not just today, but all the days after. The gathered folk clapped, and Jacob whooped loud enough for the whole prairie to hear. And as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, casting gold across the cottonwood leaves and quilt-draped chairs, Eliza smiled into the wind. She wasn't the bride who was left behind. She was the woman who found her way home, needle by needle, breath by breath,